Baal worship led to concentrations of power, injustice for the poor, and oppression of the weak. Throughout the Old Testament, from the beginning all the way through, we find the repeated pattern, the stories of the Israelites turning away from Yahweh, seeking security and safety in Baal or similar worship, and then being called back to the Lord by prophets. The narrative of Elijah, Ahab, and Jezebel kind of epitomizes this cycle, serving as a symbolic representation of apostasy. That's the technical term for renunciation of God, Yahweh. In our modern culture, we have similar reference characters who allow us to encompass a whole moral lesson in just a few words. For example, if I say, "Don't be like Captain Ahab," it's likely to call up an entire narrative arc, yes? The big white whale that boils down to the message of not becoming obsessed with a certain kind of power to the point that we will let others suffer and die to achieve the goal. And if you didn't already know, now you know Melville's biblical model for Captain Ahab. More recent examples might be Thanos or Voldemort, who both conveniently also have a little name play going on, in this case referencing death, right? Again, when they're mentioned, the whole story arc immediately comes to mind, offering a clear moral message. It kind of boils down to don't be like them. So when the gospel writer Mark compares Jesus and John the Baptizer to Elijah, he is telling the audience to frame the next part of the story as an Elijah versus Ahab trope. We might instead today say George Bailey versus Mr. Potter, or Frodo versus Sauron, or Harry versus Voldemort. The theme is the same. Who will succumb to the ancient allure of Baal worship, turning away from God's commandments to love God and love our neighbor in the pursuit of power at all costs? And with the framing of Elijah, Ahab, and Jezebel, we really don't need much description to fill in the details of the story of John, Herod, and Herodias, do we? It's all there. The parallels are obvious because the cycle continues. The message seems clear. Don't be like Herod. And so the cycle continues. We are called to follow God and obey the commandments, but worldly fears sidetrack us. A prophet calls us back to God, but we often suffer before we find our path again. We don't call it Baal worship anymore, but not much has really changed. Christian writer Rachel Held Evans observed that instead of fertility, agriculture, and prosperity, it's now sex, money, and power. Tempting forces indeed. When we look back to the Bible stories, we find hints of why Baal worship is so tempting. Underneath all the politics and scheming, isn't there really a desire for security and safety? We want to make Ahab and Jezebel, Herod and Herodias the villains. But on some level, we can kind of relate to their sense of responsibility. How do we protect our nation? How do we take care of our own? How do we protect our children? what's going to happen next? In times like these, fear starts to take on a shape of its own. A weight that presses on our chests. A might that weighs down our shoulders. A power that pulls our thoughts away. The underlying force of Baal is fear. A fear that drives the constant message of what if? What if? What if? And the cycle continues. But the cycle does not stop here. The cycle does not stop at fear. Over and over again, God calls God's people back. Generation after generation, God sends prophets to remind us. But the message is not, don't be like Herod. That's the fear talking. Don't be like them. That's the divisive force of Baal driving wedges in our community. The prophets only had one message, ever. Elijah, Elisha, Micah, Jeremiah, Isaiah, John the Baptizer, and Jesus. Generation after generation. Repent, meaning literally turn around. Don't turn from us to them. Don't turn from here to there. Turn around. Love God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. The darkness is real. The fear is compelling. But we have never been alone. It's up to us to seek the prophets. It's up to us to remember that the only force that truly conquers evil is love.